Okay, perfect. So I'm going to just quickly run you through who I am and what my work at the Government of Canada has been like since I joined a bit over 2.5 years ago. I will give you a little bit of an introduction to Gender-Based Analysis Plus and what it is and how it's still a complicated thing within the government. Then I'll talk a little bit about what the Defund Big Tech report is and its proposals specifically for government and policymakers. And then I'll draw on some of my experiences in government to highlight some of the challenges with the report before sort of ending with a closing about the futures of GovTech. I think it's really important as a feminist scholar and a public servant to start with a positionality statement so that you know where any of the upcoming content comes from. I want you to know that I'm a white, queer, non-binary settler Canadian and a first-generation academic. I was born and raised in a working class household in Edmonton, Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, but I've been super privileged to live, work, and play all over the world. Some of these photos are just from a couple of the places I've been lucky enough to live and work. Right now, I'm currently based in what's called, in a lot of government circles, the NCR, the National Capital Region, which is Ottawa, located on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe lands. And I have been splitting my time between being a part-time academic, an activist, and a public servant. So when I say that I've been a public servant, I mean that I've had most recently 2 different jobs within the Government of Canada. I was an IT research analyst at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada for almost 2 years. And then for the last 6.5 to 7 months, I've been a research manager at ESDC. I have not been working in procurement. I have not been working in tech leadership officially, even though I am a research manager. That's not within the government structures and hierarchies and actual leadership positions. So that means I haven't been involved in any of the decisions about what tech we should be purchasing. I don't have a say in how we decide whose technologies we procure. But, you know, deeply entwined in those decisions are the type of work that I have been contributing to. First, from a regulatory perspective, when I was at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, our team would influence the sort of design decisions that people would be making with the technologies that they were selecting or creating. And also now in my research position, I've been able to sort of craft some recommendations for how certain technologies in a couple of projects could potentially look if they actually get pursued and purchased and implemented. So both of the roles that I've had, I've brought a feminist perspective to. I know that that F word is a still really complicated word, not only in academia, but also in the Government of Canada. What I've tried to do since joining the Government of Canada is align a lot of my language about what it means to be a feminist and what it means to be working in a feminist government with the language that we as a government have also adopted. So when Justin Trudeau came into power, he declared the Government of Canada to be a feminist government. It has really enabled a lot of people like me and some of my really brilliant peers to come out and openly talk about bringing feminist perspectives to their work. And it's also created more space for GBA Plus, which is, again, Gender-Based Analysis Plus, to become a more commonplace set of tools and training offerings for people within the Government of Canada to offer. So what is GBA Plus training? What is it supposed to let people in the government explore and examine? It's meant to help them understand the difference between sex and gender. It's meant to help them understand the importance of considering sex and gender when developing programs, policies, and initiatives. That includes in technology spaces, but it's definitely not limited to it. Global Affairs Canada is really well known for applying feminist perspectives and GBA Plus specifically to many of its programs, including how it evaluates its programs. By saying that you're bringing a consideration of sex and gender to it and trying to think through how that's important to different programs, policies, and initiatives. For the government, they've really tried to emphasize keeping intersectionality in it. So that means recognizing how various identity factors can influence your experiences of those initiatives, of those policies, of those programs. It's really, if you go through the training program and really sort of engage with a lot of the materials, that it can be a great entry point for identifying how to think through how more responsive and effective your programs can be to serve the people who are currently in Canada or who are coming to Canada. However, even though it is a great entry point, especially for people who don't have academic training in this space, I would say that it still has not become as effective as it could be. There's a lot of challenges still within the government because it is a set of settler colonial institutions in terms of understanding and addressing the inequities amongst many racialized and marginalized communities that the government is attempting to solve. And there are many programs, there are many community groups, there are many government-funded research projects which are starting to unpack a lot of that and to try to make progress on it. But we still have a lot of work to do in terms of actually being an intersectional feminist set of organizations, actually addressing the inequities amongst racialized and marginalized communities that the government is meant to serve. And for me, as somebody working in the government, I think GBA Plus has been a call for us to rethink how the government crafts its policies to serve the people in or coming to what is currently known as Canada. But I also think it's a call for us to rethink through who and what organizations are involved with how the government crafts its policies, programs, and practices. And I think we still have, as many of the folks underpinning some of these initiatives have widely pointed out, and rightfully so, we still have a lot of work to do on that front, which is also where I think the Defund Big Tech report becomes really useful and helpful for a lot of us in government. I think taking inspiration from the worldwide calls to defund the police, I think the Defund Big Tech report asks us to rethink which communities are currently being served by tech companies, and if those are the same tech companies that we should then be giving our time, money, and resources to, instead of, say, redirecting big tech successes their excessive revenue flows towards better serving human needs, much like defund the police community groups have called for of our funding choices for policing services. For those of you who have never heard of the Big Tech, Defund Big Tech report, I think I'm probably getting ahead of myself a little bit. So I'll just quickly address what is big tech, because I think it's really important. The report identifies 5 specific companies that it classes as big tech. It's not just the report that classifies these folks as big tech. Lots of others, lots of activists, lots of groups also consider Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Google/Alphabet to be the big 5 US technology companies. They have a significant amount of overall revenue that they generate. There are also comparably sized Chinese tech giants, as the report outlines, but a lot of conversations about big tech and defunding them focus on the big 5, which are Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Google. Why should we defund those companies? Why should we even care about thinking through who gets our money? The report offers 3 main reasons. The first being that big tech visionaries often start their technology companies, or at least rely on ideas and innovations and processes that are, based on research at or from publicly funded institutions, whether they're publicly funded universities or publicly funded research and development organizations, like within Canada, the National Research Council, which has produced a lot of really innovative tech. Secondly, despite the fact that big tech visionaries rely on publicly funded research and development, uh, public institutions have been systematically deprived of the tax revenues generated by those innovations that big tech companies end up building on. You know, it's many of us will know that most big tech companies are not actively paying their taxes. We need to tax the rich. This is a thing that our big tech companies are actively avoiding and lobbying against doing. And for us to be able to better benefit from some of the investments that our public institutions have been making, I think that absolutely needs to change, and the report highlights great reasons for doing it. The report also highlights that many of big tech's revenues are generated by you, by users, by people who engage with the systems, which again are already built on these concepts and tools and technologies from publicly funded research and development organizations. It also, the revenues are also generated thanks to the extractive, underpaid, and wide network of invisible labor that underpins those companies. Many of the people who are least served by big tech companies are already least served by many of our public institutions. And the report really thoroughly highlights how those three intersecting reasons give us enough, those alone are enough for us to want to defund big tech. The report also highlights many of the other commonplace criticisms that you'll hear about big tech related to surveillance capitalism, discriminatory data and design practices, the increase in misinformation, the effectiveness of their lobbying practices, and a lot of other criticisms of big tech that you will encounter regularly outside of the report. So for me, when I read the report, it was a compelling case for us to shift the discussion away from the question of why we should defund big tech, rather to focus on how do we defund big tech. And very fortunately, the report also has some recommendations, some very well-sourced and diversely inspired proposals for how different communities can help to defund big tech. They have proposals for sort of 5 different sets of communities. They have one set of proposals for big tech itself, one set of proposals for governments and policymakers, one set of proposals for tech workers or tech researchers, one for civil society organizations and social movements, and another for us as individuals. So again, don't want to go into all of the details of every single one and take up far more time than any of us have today to discuss every single set of proposals. So I would again encourage you to go and read those in the report themselves. But I'm going to focus on the governments and policymakers set of recommendations, in part because of my roles within the GOC, but also because a lot of the people who I engage with in my spare time and in academic communities happen to also speak to governments and policymakers. So the report offers a preface to the proposals for governments and policymakers. I think it's really important to note they don't offer a definition of either the phrase, either the term governments or policymakers. And for me, within the Canadian context, I think it's almost a little bit unhelpful to be presented with a set of proposals without identifying who we mean in terms of governments and policymakers. You know, we have 3 formal layers of government within our federated system. And then on top of that, we also have indigenous systems of government. So if we are going to be making proposals to government actors, if they are to defund big tech, I think we need to be really specific about which government actors we are referring to. Same with policymakers is a phrase that could apply to the elected officials who help craft certain policies and laws, but it could also very easily and absolutely should apply to all of the public sector employees who draft the proposals, write briefing notes, contribute to the knowledge that actually goes into creating new policies. And the types of power that each of those groups have is very, very different. So asking them to be able to undertake certain types of work is in some cases going to be appropriate, in some cases going to be very, very inappropriate. So for me, what I would say and what I would caution for any Canadians, especially Canadian government employees who might be engaging with this part of the report, I would just say be open to a flexible interpretation of what government and what policymakers as those two distinct terms might mean, because as you'll see in a tiny little bit, the proposals kind of speak to multiple different layers and multiple different types of roles within those broad categories. So what are the actual proposals for governments and policymakers? There's a pretty big wall of text here in front of you, and for that, I'm sorry. I know this is a terrible thing to put in front of people on a slide, but there are 10 proposals that are pretty compelling for people involved in the government and/or policymaking spaces across Canada. I'd say that the 6 that are on this side are really valuable proposals for us to have conversations about in tandem with lawyers who work in this space. I think having their perspectives, especially on things like antitrust laws and designating large tech platforms as platform utilities, would be really, really helpful. They'll have a much better idea of how to make those things happen within our current legal structures and across provinces, territories, cities, and the federal government context. I'm not going to speak to any of those 6. I'm going to specifically focus on the 4 in the second column, because I have a lot more that I could reflect on from my experiences with regards to these 4 proposals. So the first of those 4 proposals is that governments and policymakers should establish strong international privacy and other digital rights regimes robust enough to effectively protect individuals, as well as to help abolish the surveillance capitalism business model. I'll just pause and say that if you haven't encountered the phrase surveillance capitalism before, Shoshana Zuboff's work is incredible and you should engage with it. There are plenty of resources out there for you to go and dig into about surveillance capitalism. And the report also includes some references about that term and what it might mean, especially in this context. About international privacy and other digital rights regimes, I'm here for establishing strong new requirements. I like this proposal quite a lot. I think big tech companies, as the report rightly points out, have been very effective at lobbying for weaker privacy and digital rights regimes. So I want to do a yes and with this proposal. If I'm bringing my intersectional lens, if I'm thinking about GBA plus and applying it to this first proposal, I'm not actually so convinced that strong international privacy and other digital rights regimes would be the easiest solution, or even necessarily the best solution for rethinking how big tech companies bring and influence our privacy context. There's been a lot of really, really great work by scholars around the world calling to decolonize privacy studies, calling to decolonize privacy laws, calling to decolonize data itself. And I'm not sure that having an international privacy regime would actually allow us to fully engage with our need to decolonize. I would be more concerned about an international privacy regime actually embedding colonial structures and embedding settler colonial especially, ideas about how privacy should look and how data should be accessible and used by these big tech companies. So I almost would want to push us to reflect a little bit more about how we could get away from international privacy regimes and think through some of the proposals that people in Canada have been bringing up. There have been very, very wonderful and positive conversations, I think, including within the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, about bringing Indigenous Canadian conceptions of privacy into the legal space. And this includes having more communal conceptions of privacy. How does your data intersect with your peers' data, and how does your ability to share information about them and with them affect your community at large? Right now, our privacy bills are always very, very individualistic. They think about individual rights and individual freedoms around privacy. And I think if we're actually going to work towards defunding big tech in a way that gets us out of our continual cycles of exploitation and extraction, we need to look to Indigenous Canadians and their conceptions of privacy to learn from them to really come up with something new and challenging for what we would consider right now to be an acceptable set of privacy laws. I'm also just not convinced, based on how Bill C-11 unfolded, I'm also just not convinced that in Canada right now we have the sort of perspectives coming to the development of our privacy and data rights regimes and laws. I'm not sure we have the perspectives that will give us a more safe and secure sort of set of interactions with big tech anyway. Bill C-11 was really highly criticized by some of our top privacy scholars, including Teresa Scassa, and consent was gutted. It certainly, some of the outdated data protection laws, the outdated parts of PIPEDA were being rethought, and the Privacy Act as well, but there was still a long way to go. So we haven't seen any indications that our current set of policymakers and our current set of folks within government rethinking privacy laws are going to come up with anything particularly challenging to big tech. So shifting our focus and trying to learn from Indigenous communities and trying to get a better sense of how our existing legal structures have failed certain communities, I think would be probably more useful than establishing strong international privacy and other data rights regimes. I think something a little bit more nuanced for Canada's context would probably be helpful. The second proposal that I wanted to speak to from some of my experiences is the reduced dependence of public tech on big is to reduce dependence of public institutions on big tech. The proposal that across several sectors, notably defense, government services, and education, governments have come to rely heavily on big tech services, making it harder to rein in their excesses. Instead, public institutions could leverage their collective power in order to develop their own services or support the development of alternative community-governed services that are not controlled by big tech. I am a huge fan of any sort of proposal that encourages the government to invest in its own technical resources, to invest in the tech employees that it has, to try to encourage them to develop better systems and services. Unfortunately, also, it's a pretty unique situation that we're in Canada. Sean Boots and Lucas Turkowski of Civic Tech Ottawa have done a lot of really great work on the tech companies and the big four consulting firms that get a lot of our federal, at least, funding, that get a lot of our federal dollars. You can read a lot about this. There's a whole, I can share the link to the GitHub page where they posted a lot of the data underpinning their analysis. But there's they launched a project that looked at all of the different companies that were getting our dollars and how they were serving us. And if you check this out, this is the list of the top 10 companies who have secured contracts with the Government of Canada and the amount of money that they have secured. You'll notice that only one of the big 5 tech companies is in this list. Now, certainly it could be argued that Bell Canada and IBM Canada will have services that are entwined with the other big tech companies. And so probably somewhere in there, there's work to be done to reduce their funding. But merely focusing on the big 5 and shifting our funding away from them in Canada's case won't exactly get us to the space where we would be able to properly fund tech people working within government, the service design people that we would need to have working in government to develop those adequate digital technologies to replace the systems that we currently rely on. I think for us, there's a need for rethinking through a lot of our contracting regulations, a lot of the ways that people can source digital technologies and the services that we need and the supports that we need to implement new digital technologies. Absolutely, the Canadian Digital Services folks are doing some really brilliant design and development work, but they are not enough to serve all of the needs in government. And what I have seen within ESDC, Employment and Social Development Canada, is that there is a real lack of the knowledge and skills, a real opportunity to improve the knowledge and skills of employees who have to be designing and developing services to meet Canadians' needs. And that's mostly in the benefit space. This applies to stories I've heard from friends in IRCC, Immigration Refugee Canada, and any of the organizations that deal with bringing new Canadians to Canada, any of the organizations that deal with helping people get passports and access to any government services, Health Canada, they all need more training when it comes to proper service design, so that we are actually working with Canadians to develop systems that meet their needs. So again, Sean Boots and Lurkus Chukuski and the Civic Tech Ottawa folks have done a lot of really great work about procurement issues and some of the challenges around who we give our funds to, including tech companies and consulting companies, who are a different source of really problematic design and development decisions. I will happily share links to some of their public work so that you can go and dig into that later. But for me, reading their work suggests that reducing dependence of public institutions on big tech as a proposal is not going to resonate so clearly with a lot of folks in the federal government, because they can say clearly, like, we're not actually funding those people. They don't actually get our money. Other folks do, and they provide us the services and tools that we rely on anyway. So for that one, I think we'll need to do a little bit of tweaking within Canada to approach how we defund those organizations a little bit differently, and think through if there are other large tech companies that also should have a reduction in their funding, so that we can instead fund internal development of staff, knowledge, as well as digital technologies and services. The third proposal, to consult and collaborate with professional organizations, is one that I think I might have even at one point put in one of my own papers. You know, there was a time where I thought, yes, consulting and collaborating with an organization like the ACM, or working with labor organizations and unions and human rights groups, is a brilliant idea, and absolutely something that our governments and policymakers should embrace. My perspective over time has shifted a little bit, and being in Ottawa has helped with that. The first bit that it's shifted on is actually not because I've been in Ottawa, it's because the ACM is problematic as fuck. Like, I don't think that partnering with them is necessarily going to help Canada and its federal institutions decolonize and rethink its service offerings any more than partnering with big tech would help us with. And I see Christoph smiling, which makes me happy, because I understand he's also done some pretty critical writing about the ACM and its ethics processes. So I hope that's at least falling on other people's sympathetic ears. Something I have learned since coming to Ottawa, though, is that partnering with labor unions especially, and some of the human rights groups that exist here in Canada, isn't so straightforward. It's seen, partnerships with unions are looked at as something that our central agency, TBS, the Treasury Board Secretariat, is more responsible for. I used to propose bringing labor unions into conversations at work, at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and people would always just sort of bristle at the suggestion, like, that's more of a central agency thing. Like, I don't know that they should be involved in these conversations. I'm sure when it comes to some digital technology conversations, a few of our unions would have interesting opinions about those topics, but I'm also under the impression that many of our unions are understaffed and underserved by sort of any critical take of digital technologies. So I'm less sure that consulting and collaborating with professional organizations would give the federal institutions and federal policymakers the critical lens they would need to be able to defund big tech organizations. However, I definitely think there are plenty of academics, especially certain academics in this call. I'm like 100% gonna call out Beth Coleman, she's amazing. Like there are plenty of professors. I think Andrew's also done work with there's too many to list, sorry. I've too many amazing people in this call and I'm gonna fan person over you. I think that there are individual academics and individuals within institutions that we could potentially work with, and then absolutely community groups and indigenous community groups who could help the government think through some of its alternative options for developing digital technologies and services. But I don't think the ACM should be one of them necessarily. And unfortunately for us in the federal government, there's a lot of complications around partnering with labor unions. So the last bullet calls for us, the last proposal calls for us to collaborate and consult across governmental bodies, including towns, cities, regional as well as national, international, supranational bodies. That's where you sort of get to assume that all of these proposals were made for the federal government level, but yeah, it could have applied to any other level as well. But I love this set of proposals. Also at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, I was very lucky to work with other provincial privacy and information commissioner offices, and it was always interesting to hear differences in perspectives across the federal laws versus the provincial laws. However, these are just a couple of photos from this past week. Provinces and the federal government often are, at least on the political side, sometimes in the institutional side, at odds with each other. And there will be times where consulting with them would only further entrench the ideas and the ideals that the Defund report actually calls for getting rid of, rather than helping us to do anything sort of critical and new and to rethink our existing structures. I love the idea of collaborating with our provincial peers. I love the idea of collaborating across international and supranational bodies. I just think that for folks who want to actively work towards what the Defund report outlines, it's not going to be so straightforward, and we'll need to be very, very, very strategic about who our allies are and whose wants, needs, and interests they're actually serving. I meant to get a screenshot also of the like close, tight-knit nature of the Facebook lobbyist who's based here in Ottawa, and for a time had a post at Carleton University, and like him cozying up with Trudeau, because yeah, even some of our policymakers are very invested in the current structures, and our politicians are very invested in those structures, and I'm not sure that partnering with them would be very helpful either. So those are some of my concerns that I've seen based on some of my friends' work, based on my own experiences. Again, there's a lot in the Defund Big Tech report that I really like and that I think we absolutely need to pursue. I think we need to defund Big Tech now, if not 2 years ago, if not 5 years ago, if not longer. And what's really great about the Defund Big Tech report is that it asks us to work towards an alternate future than what we're currently working towards. And I think we need to have more of that. I think we need to have these ongoing conversations within government organizations, across government organizations, at every level within Canada, and with policymakers, whether they're elected politicians or long-term indeterminate staff of government organizations. We don't have many spaces to have those sorts of conversations, though, which is why I feel very fortunate to have you folks here today. I'm hoping that this has given you enough to think through and to bring your own perspectives to. I'm especially excited that we have some folks from the Government of Canada here, and I'm hoping to hear their perspectives on what was just shared. We need more spaces where everybody can bring their dreams, and about defunding big tech specifically, to conversations so that we can engage with each other and come up with new futures. I personally don't have a clear idea in my mind other than that there is so much more work to be done decolonizing our institutions on every possible level. We need to hire new staff. We need to hire different staff. Racism, systemic racism is a thing in the Government of Canada. Ableism is a very well documented thing in the Government of Canada. Erasing our past is a very common thing in the Government of Canada. And my dream would be that we'd be able to get away from all of that and defund big tech at the same time. But it's a big dream, and there are a lot of really complicated steps to get there. And some days I feel really overwhelmed dealing with all of that. So here, just in case you're feeling a similar amount of like overwhelming energy, here's a slide of corgis in costumes being really cute. Maybe that will bring you a little bit of joy and give you just a moment of pause before I turn this back over to all of you, and we could maybe have a conversation about all of this. But yeah, that's my talk for now. Thank you for listening. Corgis, hurrah, yay, the end. I could say also that can I get out of this and stop screen sharing? There, I think it's done. I would also say that I had originally hoped to spend some of my time during the fellowship taking the proposals to executives across the Government of Canada, having a conversation with them about the proposals and getting their perspectives on them, and seeing how they imagined they could implement them or not implement them. Unfortunately, that did not work out. I could not get the ethical approval done through Carleton in time to get the research done to give this talk. So it's one of those future projects that I hope one day to be able to get to instead. For now. Anybody have any thoughts? Even just, I disagree with everything you said. Here's what I think. I'll take that too.